The wind that morning cut through Juneau like a blade forged in hell's own ice, and I should have known it was carrying more than just the promise of another brutal winter. I had been walking these frozen streets for 7 years as the town's postman, my boots carving the same paths through snow that seemed to fall harder each season, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for what I would find on the doorstep of McKenna's old trading post. The silence that greeted me wasn't the usual quiet of a town still sleeping. It was the kind of silence that holds secrets, the kind that makes a man's heart pound against his ribs like a prisoner desperate for freedom. As I approached that weathered wooden door, my breath forming clouds in the bitter air, I felt something shift in the very fabric of my ordinary life. The letters in my leather satchel suddenly felt heavier, as if they knew they would soon be forgotten in favor of a mystery that would consume every waking moment I had left. What I discovered there, wrapped in shadows and mystery, would haunt me until my dying day. But first, I need you to understand that some stories change a man forever, and this one nearly destroyed me. My name is Thomas Whitmore, and that December morning in 1903 started like any other in this godforsaken corner of Alaska. The sun barely kissed the horizon before hiding again, leaving us in that perpetual twilight that drives men to drink and women to prayer, while the temperature dropped so low that spit would freeze before it hit the ground. I pulled my woolen coat tighter around my shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of the mailbag against my hip, each letter and package representing a connection to the outside world that kept our isolated community from completely losing its mind. The snow crunched beneath my boots with that distinctive sound that every Alaskan knows, the sound of winter claiming another day, another soul, another piece of hope. As I made my way down Front Street, the wooden buildings seemed to lean inward like old men sharing secrets, their walls thick with frost and their windows glowing dimly with the warm light of oil lamps. I had delivered mail to every door in. This town knew every face, every story, every heartbreak that lived behind those frosted panes of glass. But as I turned the corner toward McKenna's old trading post, something felt different, as if the very air around me had thickened with anticipation. The trading post had been abandoned for 3 months, ever since old McKenna took sick and died, in his sleep, leaving behind nothing but debts and the lingering smell of tobacco and leather that seemed to seep from the wooden walls themselves. I usually just walked past it on my route, glancing at the boarded windows and the "For Sale" sign that swayed in the wind like a funeral banner, but today something made me stop. There, on the snow-covered steps, was a bundle that didn't belong, a dark shape against the white that made my stomach clench with a mixture of curiosity and dread. I approached slowly, my boots making soft, crunching sounds that seemed too loud in the morning stillness. And as I got closer, I could see it was wrapped in what looked like a military coat. The fabric was worn and faded, the kind of coat that had seen battles and bloodshed, that had kept a soldier warm in trenches far from home, and now it was here, discarded on a doorstep like an unwanted memory. My hands shook as I reached down, not from the cold but from something deeper, something that told me this moment would divide my life into before and after. The bundle was heavier than I expected and warm, and as I carefully pulled back a corner of the coat, I saw a tiny face, peaceful in sleep, with cheeks flushed pink from the cold. But this discovery was only the beginning of something far more sinister than I could have imagined. A baby, a living, breathing baby, no more than a few weeks old, wrapped in that mysterious military coat like a gift from the gods or a curse, from the devil himself. My first instinct was to look around, to search the empty street for some sign of who could have left this precious burden here. But the snow had covered any tracks that might have been left, and the only sounds were the distant barking of sled dogs and the whistle of wind through the bare trees. I picked up the child, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders like a heavy blanket. And as I did, something crinkled inside the coat. Papers, hidden in an inner pocket that would soon reveal secrets I wished I had never learned. The baby's eyes opened then, the deepest blue I had ever seen, and they seemed to look right through me, as if this tiny soul already knew the truth about why it had been abandoned in this frozen wasteland. I tucked the bundle against my chest, feeling the child's warmth seep through my clothes, and hurried toward the doctor's house, my mind racing with questions that had no easy answers. Who was this child, and why had someone wrapped it in a soldier's coat before leaving it to the mercy of an Alaskan winter? The coat itself told a story. Worn patches where medals might have hung, a small tear that could have been from shrapnel, and a smell that spoke of campfires and gunpowder and faraway places. But the most disturbing part was yet to come, hidden in those papers that rustled with each step I took. Dr. Harrison lived just 3 blocks away, but it felt like miles as I carried that baby through the snow, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination that I had never experienced before. The child didn't cry, didn't make a sound, just stared up at me with those impossible blue eyes that seemed to hold wisdom far beyond its few weeks of life, and I found myself whispering promises I wasn't sure I could keep. As I climbed the steps to the doctor's house, I noticed how the baby's tiny fingers had wrapped around a fold in my coat, holding on with a grip that seemed to say, "Don't let me go. Don't let me disappear like whoever brought me here." Dr. Harrison answered the door in his nightgown, his gray hair wild with sleep. But the moment he saw what I was carrying, his expression shifted from annoyance to concern, and he ushered me into his warm parlor without a word. We laid the baby on his examination table, and as he began his gentle inspection, I pulled the papers from the coat's inner pocket with trembling hands. There were 3 items: a birth certificate with no father's name listed, a military discharge paper dated 6 months earlier, and a letter written in a woman's delicate handwriting that made my blood run cold. The letter was addressed to my dearest love, and it spoke of betrayal, of promises broken, and of a secret that must never see the light of day. But it was the signature at the bottom that made me realize this mystery ran deeper than a simple abandonment. The signature read, "Forever yours, Margaret Sinclair," and I knew that name, knew it well enough to understand that this baby's appearance in Juneau was no accident. Margaret Sinclair was the daughter of Judge Sinclair, one of the most powerful men in the territory, a man whose word was law and whose enemies had a habit of disappearing into the wilderness never to be seen again. She had left town suddenly, the previous winter, supposedly to visit relatives in Seattle, but the whispers had followed her. Whispers about late-night meetings, about a love affair with a soldier stationed at Fort William, about a scandal that could destroy her family's reputation. Dr. Harrison looked up from his examination, his face grave but relieved, and told me the baby was healthy but had been born recently, probably within the last 2 weeks, which meant Margaret had given birth somewhere nearby and then made the desperate decision to abandon her child. The military coat belonged to Lieutenant James Morrison, according to the discharge papers, a man who had served with distinction in the Philippines before being released due to injuries sustained in battle. I remembered Morrison, tall, handsome, with eyes the same impossible blue as the baby now sleeping peacefully on the doctor's table. He had courted Margaret openly during his time in Juneau, but when he left for the war, she had supposedly forgotten him and moved on with her life. But looking at this baby, at those familiar eyes, I realized that some love affairs never truly end. They just go underground, festering like wounds in the frozen earth. As I held that tiny child close to my chest, listening to the soft sound of its breathing and feeling the steady beat of its heart against mine, I made a decision that would change everything. I would not turn this baby over to the authorities, would not let it disappear into some distant orphanage where its true identity would be lost forever. Something in those blue eyes, something in the way it had gripped my coat, told me that this child was meant to be protected, that the secret of its parentage was dangerous enough to kill for. Dr. Harrison agreed to keep our discovery quiet for now, understanding without words that involving Judge Sinclair or the territorial government would likely mean the baby's death, either through neglect or something more deliberate. I took the child home that day, telling my neighbors I was caring for it temporarily until permanent arrangements could be made, but in my heart, I knew I was already planning to raise it as my own. The military coat hung in my closet like a piece of evidence, and the letters remained hidden in my strongbox, but I could feel them calling to me, demanding that I dig deeper into the truth. Margaret Sinclair and Lieutenant Morrison had created more than just a baby. They had created a secret that threatened to expose the corruption and violence that lurked beneath Juneau's civilized surface. And as I sat by the fire that night, watching the child sleep in a makeshift cradle, I realized that someone had tried to bury this secret in the snow, but instead, they had given it to the one man in town stubborn enough to uncover the whole bloody truth. 3 days had passed since I found the baby, and every night I lay awake, staring at that military coat hanging in my closet like a ghost demanding justice. The child, I had begun calling him Samuel, after my father, was thriving under my care, but the coat haunted me with its silent testimony to secrets I was only beginning to understand. I had examined every inch of that worn fabric, running, my fingers over the frayed edges and faded stains that told stories of battles fought in foreign lands, and each detail only deepened the mystery that was consuming my every waking thought. The wool was thick and well-made, the kind of coat issued to officers rather than enlisted men, which confirmed that Lieutenant Morrison had held rank and responsibility before whatever happened in the Philippines ended his military career. Inside the collar, I found a small tag sewn with care. J.M. May God protect you always. M.S. The initials matched what I already knew, but it was the careful stitching, the feminine hand that had sewn those words with love, that made my chest tight with emotion. This coat had been a gift, a token of affection from a woman to the man she loved, and now it served as a shroud for their abandoned child. But there was something else hidden in that coat, something that would soon make me question everything I thought I knew about Margaret Sinclair and James Morrison. The morning of the 4th day brought Mrs. Henderson to my door, her sharp eyes scanning my small cabin with the intensity of a hawk searching for prey. She was the town's unofficial keeper of secrets, a widow who had made it her business to know everyone's affairs, and her presence at my doorstep filled me with dread. "Thomas Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I hear you've taken in a foundling, and I think it's time we discuss the proper arrangements for such a situation." I invited her in, knowing that refusing would only increase her suspicions, and watched as her gaze immediately fell upon little Samuel sleeping peacefully in his cradle near the fire. Her expression softened for just a moment, the way it always did when she looked at children, but then hardened again as she noticed the military coat folded carefully on a nearby chair. "That's a fine coat for a baby," she observed, her tone suggesting she knew more than she was letting on. I felt my pulse quicken as she moved closer to examine it, her weathered fingers tracing the fabric with the expertise of someone who had spent years working with textiles. "Union Army, I'd say, probably officer's issue and not that old either," she continued, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made me feel like a criminal caught in the act. But what she said next made my blood run cold with the realization that this secret was already spreading through town like wildfire. "Funny thing," Mrs. Henderson continued, settling herself in my best chair without invitation. "I was talking to Mary Sullivan yesterday, and she mentioned seeing you with a bundle near McKenna's old place 3 mornings ago." The way she emphasized the word bundle told me she knew exactly what I had found, and her next words confirmed my worst fears about how quickly gossip traveled in a town as small as Juneau. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow seemed more threatening than if she had shouted, Mary also mentioned that the coat looked familiar, said it reminded her of the one that handsome Lieutenant Morrison used to wear when he was courting the Sinclair girl. My mouth went dry as I realized that my carefully guarded secret was already the subject of speculation among the town's most observant residents, and I could see the pieces falling into place. Behind Mrs. Henderson's calculating eyes, she knew about Margaret and Morrison, knew about the sudden departure and the whispered rumors, and now she was connecting those dots to the baby sleeping innocently by my fire. I tried to maintain my composure, offering her tea and speaking in measured tones about my temporary care for the child, but I could tell she wasn't fooled by my casual demeanor. The coat sat between us like evidence in a trial, its very presence an accusation that I couldn't deny or explain away. And when she finally stood to leave, her parting words carried a warning that made me understand just how dangerous this situation had become. "You know, Thomas," she said, pausing at the door with her hand on the latch, "there are some secrets in this town that are better left buried, especially when they involve people with the power to make problems disappear." The way she looked back at the coat, then at the baby, then at me, told me she understood exactly what kind of danger I was walking into by keeping Samuel and pursuing the truth about his parentage. After she left, I sat in my chair staring at that military coat and feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on me like an avalanche waiting to fall. I had hoped to keep the baby's discovery quiet until I could figure out the full story, but now I realized that in a town like Juneau, secrets had a way of surfacing no matter how deep you tried to bury them. The coat was more than just clothing. It was evidence of a love affair that had produced consequences powerful enough to threaten the established order of our small community. I knew that if Judge Sinclair learned about the baby's existence, he would stop at nothing to protect his family's reputation, even if it meant eliminating the child and anyone who knew about it. The military records I had found with the coat told me that Morrison had been discharged for medical reasons, but they didn't specify the nature of his injuries or his current whereabouts. As I held Samuel in my arms that evening, feeling his small body warm against my chest, I made a decision that would either save us both or destroy us. I would find Lieutenant Morrison and learn the truth about why his child had been abandoned in the snow. That night, I spread the coat out on my kitchen table and began a more thorough examination, searching for any clues that might tell me more about Morrison's fate or his connection to the baby's abandonment. The coat was heavier than it looked, the wool thick enough to stop a knife blade, and I could see why a soldier would treasure such protection against the elements and enemy weapons. In the left breast pocket, I found something I had missed before. A small photograph, creased and faded, showing Morrison in his dress uniform standing beside a woman whose face had been deliberately scratched out. The vandalism was recent, the scratches made with something sharp and wielded with enough force to suggest anger rather than accident, and I realized someone had tried to erase the woman's identity while preserving Morrison's image. The back of the photograph bore an inscription in the same feminine handwriting I had seen on the letter, "My darling James, until we meet again, M." But there was something else written below it in different ink added later that made my hands shake as I read it. "God forgive me for what I must do." The words carried the weight of a final decision, a choice made in desperation, and I began to understand that Margaret Sinclair's disappearance might not have been voluntary after all. Looking at that defaced photograph while Samuel slept nearby, I felt the pieces of a terrible puzzle beginning to form a picture I wasn't sure I wanted to see. Someone had taken great care to hide Morrison's identity while preserving evidence of Margaret's guilt, which suggested this wasn't a simple case of abandonment, but something far more sinister. The next morning brought a visitor I hadn't expected. Deputy Marshal Coleman, a man whose reputation for brutality was matched only by his loyalty to Judge Sinclair and the other powerful families who controlled the territory's politics and commerce. He stood on my doorstep in his heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat, his badge gleaming dully in the weak sunlight, and I knew immediately that Mrs. Henderson had wasted no time in sharing her suspicions with someone who could act on them. "Morning, Thomas," he said, his voice carrying the false friendliness that lawmen used when they wanted something. "I hear you've got yourself a house guest, and I thought I'd stop by to see if there's anything the marshal's office should know about." I invited him in because refusing would have been suspicious, and watched as his eyes took in every detail of my small cabin, lingering on the cradle where Samuel lay sleeping, and the chair where I had hastily hidden the military coat under a quilt. Coleman was not a subtle man, but he was thorough, and I could see him cataloging everything he saw for later reporting to whoever had sent him to investigate. He asked to see the baby, cooing over Samuel with an enthusiasm that might have seemed genuine if I hadn't known about his connection to Judge Sinclair. "Fine-looking boy," he said, his hand surprisingly gentle as he examined the child. "Reminds me of someone, though I can't quite place who." The way he said it, with that slight emphasis on the word reminds, told me he knew exactly who the baby resembled. And his next question confirmed my worst fears about how much the authorities already suspected. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about where this little fella came from, would you?" Coleman asked, his tone still casual, but his eyes sharp with the intensity of a predator sensing weakness in its prey. I told him the story I had prepared about finding the baby on my morning route and taking it in temporarily until proper arrangements could be made, but I could tell he wasn't convinced by my careful words. He walked around my cabin like he was searching for something specific, and when he approached the chair where I had hidden the coat, my heart began pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "That's a nice quilt," he said, running his hand over the fabric that concealed the military coat. "My grandmother had one just like it, made from scraps of uniforms and such." The way he pressed down on the chair, feeling the bulk of the coat beneath the quilt, told me he knew exactly what I was hiding, but for some reason he chose not to expose it. Instead, he picked up Samuel one more time, studying the baby's face with an intensity that made me want to snatch the child away from him, and then delivered a warning that left no doubt about the danger we were all in. "You know, Thomas, babies have a way of bringing out the best and worst in people. And sometimes the worst can be powerful enough to destroy anyone who gets in its way." He handed Samuel back to me with a smile that never reached his eyes, tipped his hat politely, and walked out into the snow, leaving me with the certain knowledge that our time was running out faster than I had ever imagined. The morning after Deputy Marshal Coleman's visit, I woke to find fresh snow covering Juneau like a burial shroud, and something told me the storm had brought more than just weather. It had brought answers I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Samuel was restless in his cradle, fussing in a way he hadn't done before, as if he could sense the tension that had been building in our small cabin since the authorities began sniffing around our secret. I bundled him close to my chest and stepped outside to collect firewood. But what I found scattered across my front yard made my blood freeze in my veins. Papers, dozens of them, partially buried in the snow like fragments of a shattered confession. The wind had deposited them during the night, carrying them from some unknown location and spreading them across my property like evidence in a crime scene. And as I gathered them with trembling hands, I realized they were letters. Correspondence between Margaret Sinclair and Lieutenant Morrison that someone had tried to destroy by burning. Most were too damaged to read, the edges charred black and the ink smeared by moisture. But enough remained to paint a picture of a love affair that had ended not in abandonment, but in something far more sinister. The handwriting was familiar, matching the letter I had found in the coat. But these fragments told a different story than the one I had been piecing together. And as I read the salvageable portions by lamplight, holding Samuel in one arm while turning the pages with my free hand, I began to understand that the baby's abandonment was not an act of shame, but an act of desperation born from mortal fear. The eye. first complete letter I could decipher was dated just 3 months ago, and Margaret's words carried an urgency that made my chest tight with dread. My dearest James, I fear my father has discovered our correspondence, and I worry for your safety as much as my own. The letter went on to describe Judge Sinclair's growing suspicions about her pregnancy and his violent threats against anyone who had compromised the family honor. She wrote about secret meetings with men who carried guns and asked questions about Morrison's whereabouts, about her father's rage when he learned that she refused to name the baby's father, about his promises to solve this problem permanently once he identified the man responsible. But it was her final paragraph that made me realize the true scope of the danger we were all facing. He knows about Fort William, knows about your discharge, and has men searching for you even now. If something happens to me, protect our child, but do not try to find me. Some prices are too high for love to pay. The letter was signed with her usual endearment, but the ink was blotched with what looked like teardrops, and I could imagine her writing these words while knowing they might be her last communication with the man she loved. I set the letter aside and reached for the next readable fragment, but Samuel began crying at that moment, his wails echoing through the cabin with an intensity that seemed to match the storm raging outside. As I comforted him, pressing his small head against my shoulder and whispering promises I hoped I could keep, I realized that these letters weren't just evidence of a love affair gone wrong. They were Margaret's attempt to save her child's life by ensuring someone would understand the truth if she disappeared. The second letter was even more disturbing, written in Margaret's increasingly frantic handwriting just weeks before the baby's birth. James, if you receive this, do not come to Juneau. My father's men are watching every road, every boat, every trail that leads to this cursed town. She described being held prisoner in her own home, forbidden to leave or receive visitors, while her father made arrangements for the baby's disposal immediately after birth. The letter revealed that Judge Sinclair had no intention of allowing his grandson to live, seeing the child as evidence of his daughter's disgrace rather than innocent life deserving protection. Margaret wrote about overhearing conversations between her father and Deputy Marshal Coleman, discussions about accidents that could befall unwanted infants and mothers who refused to cooperate with necessary solutions. She had managed to smuggle the letter out through a sympathetic servant, but she knew it would likely be her last chance to communicate with Morrison before giving birth. I have made arrangements with Dr. Harrison's nurse to help me escape when the time comes, she wrote. But if I cannot flee with our child, I will find a way to ensure it reaches safety, even if I cannot. The letter ended with instructions about the military coat, how she would use it as a signal to identify their baby if separation became necessary, and a promise that she would rather die than see our innocent child sacrificed to preserve my father's political ambitions. As I finished reading those desperate words, holding Samuel closer to my chest, I understood that his mother had known she was walking toward death when she wrapped him in that coat and left him on McKenna's doorstep. The third letter was the most heartbreaking, written in Margaret's hand but clearly dictated under duress. The words stilted and formal in a way that suggested someone was forcing her to write against her will. Lieutenant Morrison, I am writing to inform you that any relationship between us has ended permanently, and I do not wish to receive further correspondence from you regarding personal matters. But scattered between the forced formality were hidden messages, single words that stood out when read separately. Help, prisoner, dying, save, child. She had found a way to communicate her true situation, even while being coerced into breaking off their relationship, embedding her real message within the official rejection her father had demanded she write. The letter bore Judge Sinclair's seal at the bottom, making it clear that he had approved every word before allowing it to be sent. But Margaret's desperate creativity had turned his instrument of control into a cry for help. I could imagine Her sitting at her father's desk with Coleman or another of the judge's enforcers standing over her, dictating the words that would supposedly end her relationship with Morrison, while she secretly wove her real message throughout the text. The date on this letter was just 2 weeks before I found Samuel, which meant Margaret had been fighting for her child's life right up until the moment she was forced to abandon him. But there was one more fragment, barely legible and severely damaged by fire, that would soon reveal the true extent of Judge Sinclair's willingness to commit murder to protect his reputation. This final fragment was different from the others. Not written in Margaret's careful script, but in the harsh, angular handwriting of someone accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. The paper was expensive, the kind used for official correspondence, and at the top, I could make out part of the territorial government's letterhead. The message was addressed to someone called C, and while most of the text was destroyed, I could piece together enough words to understand its sinister purpose. The situation. Resolved permanently, no witnesses, make it look, accident, both the woman and... The fragment ended there, the rest consumed by flames. But I didn't need to read more to understand that Judge Sinclair had ordered Margaret's murder along with anyone else who knew about the baby's existence. The letter was signed with initials that made my hands shake as I recognized them. R.S. Robert Sinclair, the judge himself, giving written orders for his own daughter's assassination. I set the papers aside and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered street where normal people were going about their daily business, unaware that they lived in a town controlled by a man willing to murder his own child to maintain his political power. Samuel gurgled softly in my arms, his blue eyes, Morrison's eyes, looking up at me with complete trust, and I realized that we were now the primary targets of a conspiracy that reached from the territorial government down to the local law enforcement. But as I stood there holding that innocent baby, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders like chains, I made a decision that would either save us all or destroy us. I would find Lieutenant Morrison, dead or alive, and together, we would expose Judge Sinclair's crimes before he could silence us forever. The storm continued throughout the day, and as evening approached, I noticed something that made my blood run cold with the certainty that we were being watched. Fresh tracks in the snow around my cabin, too purposeful to be casual passers-by, too numerous to be coincidental. Someone had been circling my home, studying the layout, counting the windows and doors, preparing for something that would likely happen under cover of darkness. I gathered the letter fragments and hid them inside the military coat, then wrapped both in oilcloth and buried them beneath the floorboards under Samuel's cradle. If something happened to me, at least the evidence would survive to tell the story. The baby seemed to sense my fear, crying whenever I set him down, and only calming when I held him against my chest, and I wondered if children possessed some instinct that warned them of approaching danger. As the wind howled around my cabin, and the snow continued to fall, I loaded my rifle and placed it beside the door, then settled into my chair with Samuel in my arms to wait for whatever was coming. The letters had revealed the truth about Margaret Sinclair's fate and her father's willingness to kill to protect his secrets. But they had also shown me that Lieutenant Morrison might still be alive, might still be searching for the woman he loved and the child he had never known existed. If I could survive the night, if I could get word to Morrison about what had happened, we might have a chance to bring justice to Judge Sinclair and safety to little Samuel. But first, I had to make it through the darkness, and the footsteps I could hear crunching through the snow outside my windows told me that the judge's men had finally come to finish what they had started with Margaret. The sound of boots on my front steps came just after midnight, accompanied by the soft scraping of metal against wood that told me someone was testing my door latch with the blade of a knife. I held Samuel close, feeling his small heart beating against my chest, and raised my rifle toward the door while whispering a prayer for courage and steady aim. The wind had died down, leaving an unnatural silence that made every small sound seem amplified, and I could hear muffled voices discussing how to proceed without alerting the neighbors or leaving evidence of their presence. Through the frost-covered window, I caught glimpses of shadows moving around my cabin, at least 3 men from what I could tell, all armed and moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this kind of work before. One of them was trying to force my back door while another positioned himself at the side window where I usually kept my woodpile, and I realized they had studied my cabin carefully enough to know all possible escape routes. Samuel began to fuss, sensing my fear, and I knew that his cries would soon give away our exact location to the men who had come to kill us both. As the front door latch finally gave way and cold air began seeping into my warm cabin, I made a decision that would determine whether we lived to see morning. I would not go quietly into the darkness like Margaret had, would not let Judge Sinclair add our names to his list of problems solved permanently. The military coat hanging in my closet had belonged to a soldier, and tonight it would shelter another battle, fought not in foreign lands but in the heart of Alaska, where the snow would soon be stained with blood and the truth would finally have its day. The first shot shattered my front window and sent splinters of wood flying across the cabin like deadly rain. But it was the silence that followed that nearly stopped my heart. Not the quiet of empty space, but the focused stillness of predators waiting for their prey to reveal itself. I clutched Samuel against my chest and rolled behind my overturned table, feeling his tiny body trembling against mine as the reality of our situation crashed over me like an avalanche of fear and desperation. Through the broken window, I could see muzzle flashes in the darkness, 3 distinct positions that confirmed my count of the attackers, and I realized they weren't trying to kill us quickly. They were herding us, driving us toward the back of the cabin where someone waited to finish the job Judge Sinclair had ordered. The baby's cries were growing louder despite my attempts to comfort him, and I knew his voice would soon guide their bullets to our hiding place with deadly accuracy. I raised my rifle and fired toward the nearest shadow, hearing a grunt of pain that told me my shot had found its mark, but the return volley forced me deeper behind my makeshift barricade. As wood chips rained down around us and the smell of gunpowder filled the air, I understood that we had perhaps minutes before they overwhelmed our defenses, and the thought of Samuel dying in this frozen hell because of secrets he had never chosen to carry made me rage against the darkness with every fiber of my being. But it was what happened next that would change everything. A sound from outside that made our attackers pause and gave us the miracle we desperately needed. The thunder of hoofbeats approaching through the snow was followed by a voice I didn't recognize, shouting commands with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. "Drop your weapons and step away from that cabin, or I'll drop every one of you where you stand." The gunfire stopped abruptly, replaced by confused shouts and the sound of men scrambling for new positions, and through the broken window, I could see a lone figure on horseback silhouetted against the snow. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat that flapped in the wind like a dark wing, and even in the dim light I could see the glint of metal in his hands, 2 pistols aimed with steady precision at the men who had been trying to murder us. "You've got 10 seconds to decide whether you want to explain this to Judge Sinclair or to St. Peter," the stranger called out, his voice carrying a cold certainty that made even hardened killers think twice about their next move. I heard Deputy Marshal Coleman's voice from somewhere in the darkness, trying to establish authority. "This is official territorial business, stranger. Move along before you get hurt." But the man on horseback laughed, a sound devoid of humor that made my spine tingle with recognition, even though I was certain I had never met him before. "Official business?" he repeated, spurring his horse closer to Coleman's position. "Is that what they're calling child murder these days?" And then I saw his face in the moonlight, saw the piercing blue eyes that matched Samuel's exactly, and I realized that Lieutenant James Morrison had finally come home to claim his son. Morrison's arrival turned the tide of the battle in ways I couldn't have imagined, not just because of his skill with weapons, but because of the psychological effect his presence had on Judge Sinclair's hired killers. They had come expecting to eliminate a lone postman and an infant, a simple task that should have been completed in minutes, but now they faced a trained soldier who moved through the darkness like death itself seeking vengeance. I watched through the shattered window as Morrison dismounted and began stalking the men who had been hunting us, his movements fluid and purposeful, each step calculated to bring him closer to his enemies while keeping him invisible in the shadows. The sound of his voice carried across the snow as he spoke to each attacker by name, describing their crimes in detail and promising them the kind of justice that wouldn't wait for courts or judges. "Coleman!" he called out, his words cutting through the night air like a blade. "I know you were there when they killed Margaret. Know you held her down while Sinclair put that knife between her ribs." The deputy's response was a wild burst of gunfire that accomplished nothing except revealing his position, and I heard Morrison's soft chuckle as he closed the distance between them. "And you, Peterson," he continued, addressing another of the attackers. "I know about the other families you've destroyed for the judge, about the children who've disappeared when they became inconvenient to powerful men." One by one, he was stripping away their anonymity, their sense of safety, turning them from hunters into hunted with nothing more than the truth spoken in the darkness. The final confrontation came suddenly, a blur of movement and gunfire that ended almost before it began, leaving 2 men dead in the snow and Coleman wounded but alive. Morrison had chosen to spare the deputy's life, but not out of mercy. I heard him dragging Coleman closer to the cabin, the man's groans of pain mixing with Morrison's cold questions about Margaret's murder and the conspiracy that had led to this night of violence. Through the broken window, I could see Coleman's face in the moonlight, blood streaming from a shoulder wound, his earlier arrogance replaced by the terror of a man who knew he was facing someone with nothing left to lose. "Tell me exactly how she died," Morrison demanded, pressing the barrel of his pistol against Coleman's wounded shoulder. "Tell me who gave the orders, who held the knife, who decided that my woman and my child had to disappear to protect a corrupt judge's reputation." Coleman's confession came in gasps and sobs, a stream of details that painted a picture of Margaret's final days that made my heart break for the woman who had died trying to save her child. She had been held prisoner in her father's house for weeks, watched constantly, denied food when she refused to reveal Morrison's whereabouts, beaten when she tried to escape. The murder itself had been planned carefully, disguised as a riding accident that would explain away both Margaret's death and the disappearance of her newborn child. But Margaret had outsmarted them all, giving birth in secret with the help of Dr. Harrison's nurse and managing to escape with the baby long enough to leave it where she hoped it would be found by someone who would protect it. Coleman's final revelation made Morrison's hands shake with rage. Judge Sinclair himself had delivered the killing blow, slitting his own daughter's throat to protect his political career and then ordering her body burned to destroy any evidence of his crime. Morrison's silhouette filled my doorway as he finally entered the cabin, his face a mask of grief and fury that made him look like an avenging angel descended from heaven to deliver justice to the wicked. Samuel stopped crying the moment he saw his father, those identical blue eyes meeting across the devastated room with a recognition that transcended mere genetics. It was the meeting of souls separated by violence but reunited by love and the determination to survive. I handed the baby to Morrison without words, watching as his hard expression softened into wonder at holding his child for the first time, and I knew that whatever happened next, this moment of connection between father and son was worth all the danger we had faced. Morrison's hands, which had just dealt death to evil men, now cradled new life with infinite gentleness, and when he looked up at me with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, I saw not the cold killer who had rescued us, but the broken-hearted man who had lost everything except this one precious reminder of the woman he had loved. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Margaret wrote to me about a postman with a good heart. Said if anything happened to her, you might be the one person in this town brave enough to protect our child." He reached into his coat and pulled out a letter I hadn't seen before. This one addressed to me in Margaret's careful handwriting, and as I read her final words, I understood that even in her darkest hour, she had been planning for Samuel's survival. The letter thanked me for my kindness to the people of Juneau, expressed her hope that I would raise her son with love and honesty, and revealed the location where she had hidden evidence that would destroy her father's career and ensure justice for all his victims. But our reunion was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. Dozens of them, from the thunder of hoofbeats echoing across the frozen landscape, and Morrison's expression hardened again as he realized that Judge Sinclair had sent reinforcements to finish what Coleman and his men had started. "They're coming," he said, checking his weapons and moving toward the window. "The judge won't stop until we're all dead, and he's got enough men to burn down half of Juneau if that's what it takes." I looked around my destroyed cabin, at the blood staining the snow outside, at the evidence of Margaret's murder scattered across my floor, and I knew that running would only delay the inevitable. Sinclair's reach extended throughout the territory, and there was nowhere we could hide that his influence couldn't eventually find us. But Morrison had a different plan, one that would require more courage than I thought I possessed, but offered the only real chance for Samuel to grow up free from his grandfather's shadow. "There's a place Margaret told me about," he said, bundling, Samuel in the military coat that had started this whole nightmare. "A cabin up in the mountains where she hid supplies and evidence, enough to bring down not just Sinclair, but the whole corrupt network he's part of." He handed me a map drawn in Margaret's hand, showing a route through the wilderness that would take us beyond the reach of conventional pursuit. "It's dangerous," he warned, "but it's our only chance to end this on our terms." As the sound of riders grew closer, and the first shouts of searchers echoed through the night, I grabbed my rifle and what few supplies I could carry, knowing that we were about to begin a journey that would either lead us to justice or to frozen graves in the Alaskan wilderness. The three of us slipped out the back of my cabin just as Judge Sinclair's men surrounded the front, disappearing into the forest with nothing but the clothes on our backs and the hope that Margaret's final gift would be enough to save her son and expose the truth about her murder. Morrison moved through the snow like a ghost, his military training evident in every silent step, while I followed with Samuel pressed against my chest, the baby's warmth the only thing keeping the bitter cold from stealing the last of my courage. Behind us, I could hear the sound of my cabin being searched and then set ablaze, the orange glow reflecting off the snow as Judge Sinclair destroyed the last evidence of our presence in his town. But ahead of us lay the mountains, and somewhere, in those frozen peaks, Margaret Sinclair had hidden the proof that would finally bring justice to Alaska's most powerful man. The military coat wrapped around Samuel flapped in the wind like a battle flag, and as we climbed higher into the wilderness, leaving nothing but footprints in the snow that would soon be covered by the storm, I realized that this was more than just an escape. It was the beginning of a war that would determine whether truth and justice could survive in a land where money and power had corrupted everything they touched. The footprints we left behind led to nowhere that Judge Sinclair's men could follow, but they were leading us toward something far more dangerous and valuable than mere survival. They were leading us toward the truth that would either set us free or get us all killed trying. 3 days into the mountains, with Judge Sinclair's men somewhere behind us, and the temperature dropping to levels that could kill within hours, we finally reached the cabin Margaret had described in her hidden letters, a structure so perfectly concealed among the pine trees and granite outcroppings that we nearly walked past it despite following her detailed map. Morrison had pushed us relentlessly through snow that reached our waists, carrying Samuel when the cold became too much for the baby to bear, his face a mask of determination that never wavered even when exhaustion threatened to drop us all in our tracks. I had begun to doubt we would ever find the place, had started to wonder if Margaret's final refuge existed only in the desperate imagination of a woman facing death. But there, it stood before us like a miracle carved from logs and hope. The cabin was small but well built, designed to withstand the brutal mountain winters that could bury a structure under 20 feet of snow, and as Morrison forced open the frozen door, I felt the first warmth I had experienced since we fled, Juneau seeping from within. But it was what we found inside that made me understand why Margaret had been so confident this place would provide everything we needed to destroy her father and expose the corruption that had poisoned our territory. The single room was filled with documents, photographs, and evidence that represented years of careful investigation into Judge Sinclair's crimes, and I realized that Margaret had been planning his downfall long before she ever met Morrison or conceived their child. She had been building a case against her own father, documenting his murders and corruption with the meticulous attention of someone who knew that half measures would only get her killed. Morrison lit the oil lamp that sat ready on the table, and by its flickering light, we began to examine the treasure trove of evidence Margaret had assembled in this remote hideaway. There were photographs of men I recognized from Juneau, prominent citizens and government officials, taken at secret, meetings in locations that suggested conspiracy and corruption at the highest levels of territorial government. Bank records showed money flowing from mining companies to Judge Sinclair's personal accounts, payments for favorable rulings that had cost honest families their claims and sometimes their lives. Letters in the judge's own handwriting detailed plans for eliminating troublesome elements in the community, using language that made it clear these were murder contracts rather than legal proceedings. But it was the journal Margaret had kept, written in her careful script over the course of 2 years, that revealed the true scope of her father's evil and the personal courage it had taken for her to gather this evidence. "I have watched my father become a monster," one entry read, "and I can no longer pretend that family loyalty matters more than justice for his victims." She had documented every crime, every betrayal, every innocent person who had disappeared after crossing Judge Sinclair's path, and her words carried the weight of a daughter's love, corrupted by the necessity of stopping a man who had lost all claim to humanity. Morrison read these entries with tears streaming down his face, learning for the first time about the woman he had loved, understanding the danger she had accepted to protect not just their child, but every future victim of her father's ambition. Samuel slept peacefully in his father's arms, wrapped in the military coat that had become our talisman of survival, while we discovered the full extent of the legacy Margaret had left for her son. The most damning evidence was contained in a metal box hidden beneath the cabin's floorboards, and when Morrison pried it open with his knife, we found ourselves staring at proof that would destroy not just Judge Sinclair, but the entire network of corruption that controlled Alaska's territorial government. There were signed confessions from men who had committed murder on Sinclair's orders, detailed accounts of how mining claims were stolen and their owners eliminated, and correspondence between the judge and officials in Washington that revealed a conspiracy reaching all the way to the federal level. But the centerpiece of Margaret's collection was a photograph that made my blood run cold with its implications. Judge Sinclair standing over a freshly dug grave with a shovel in his hands, while 3 other men dragged a body wrapped in canvas toward the hole. The photograph was dated just 6 months ago, and on the back, Margaret had written the victim's name and the reason for his murder, a prospector who had discovered evidence of the judge's illegal mining operations and threatened to expose them to federal authorities. Morrison studied the photograph with the intensity of a man memorizing the face of his enemy, and when he looked up at me, his eyes held a cold fire that promised justice regardless of the cost. "This is enough," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "This is enough to hang him and everyone who helped him." But as I held that damning photograph in my hands, feeling the weight of justice finally within our reach, I also understood that getting this evidence back to civilization would be the most dangerous part of our journey. Judge Sinclair would kill us all before allowing these secrets to see daylight. The storm that had been building during our climb finally broke that night, trapping us in the cabin with winds that howled like banshees and snow that fell so thick we couldn't see 3 feet beyond the windows. Morrison secured the door and shutters against the weather while I prepared what food Margaret had stored in the cabin. And for the first time since finding Samuel on that doorstep in Juneau, we had time to plan our next move without the immediate threat of bullets or pursuit. The baby seemed to sense the relative safety of our refuge, sleeping more peacefully than he had since the night of the attack, and I found myself watching his small face in the lamplight and marveling at how much he resembled both his parents. Morrison told me stories about Margaret that brought her to life in ways her letters never could. How she had defied her father's expectations by learning to read legal documents and financial records. How she had used her position as the judge's daughter to gain access to evidence no one else could have obtained. How she had risked everything to document crimes that would have remained hidden forever without her courage. She knew what it would cost her, Morrison said, his voice thick with grief and pride. Knew that standing up to him would probably get her killed, but she couldn't live with the knowledge of what he was doing to innocent people. He showed me a letter she had written to him just days before her murder. One final message that revealed the depth of her love and the extent of her sacrifice. "If you're reading this," she had written, "it means I'm gone. But don't mourn for me. I chose this path knowing the risks, and I would choose it again to protect our child and stop my father's evil." The letter went on to describe her final plan, how she would fake her own death to protect Samuel and ensure the evidence reached someone who could act on it. But I could see from Morrison's expression that something had gone wrong, that Margaret's carefully laid plans had been discovered before she could execute them. Morrison's confession came slowly, drawn out by the warmth of the fire and the safety of our temporary refuge, and what he told me about Margaret's final days painted a picture of heroism and heartbreak that would haunt me for the rest of my life. She had managed to give birth in secret with the help of Dr. Harrison's nurse, a woman who had risked her own life to assist in the delivery and keep it hidden from Judge Sinclair's surveillance. For 3 days, Margaret had hidden with her newborn son in an abandoned mine shaft outside town, planning her escape to this mountain cabin where she could raise Samuel in safety while preparing to expose her father's crimes. But someone had betrayed her location to the judge. Morrison suspected the nurse had been tortured into revealing the hiding place, and Sinclair's men had found her before she could disappear permanently. "They brought her back to town in chains," Morrison said, his voice breaking with the memory of what he had learned from Coleman's confession. "Made her watch while they prepared to kill the baby. Told her she could save his life by revealing where she had hidden the evidence." But Margaret had been smarter than her captors, had anticipated this possibility, and made arrangements that would protect both her child and her life's work. She had convinced them that the evidence was hidden in Seattle, that she would need to travel there personally to retrieve it. And while they debated whether to believe her lies, she had managed one final desperate act of love. Escaping from her guards during a carefully planned moment of distraction, she had wrapped Samuel in Morrison's military coat and placed him on McKenna's doorstep, trusting that the one honest man she knew in Juneau would find him and understand the significance of his clothing. The coat was meant to be a message to Morrison, a signal that would lead him to both his child and the evidence needed to destroy Judge Sinclair, but it had taken him months to decode Margaret's final communication and track us to this frozen sanctuary. The next morning brought a silence that was almost supernatural, the kind of absolute quiet that follows a blizzard and makes every small sound seem amplified in the crystal-clear air. Morrison ventured outside to check our surroundings and returned with news that chilled me more than the sub-zero temperature: fresh tracks in the snow around the cabin, made sometime during the storm by someone who had found our hiding place. despite the weather and the careful concealment Margaret had built into this refuge. The tracks were too large to belong to any animal, too purposeful to be from a lost traveler, and the way they circled the cabin suggested surveillance rather than casual discovery. "They've found us," Morrison said simply, checking his weapons, and beginning to pack the evidence we had discovered. "Sinclair must have had someone watching this place, waiting for us to lead them here." But as we prepared for what might be our final confrontation, Samuel began crying with an intensity that seemed to echo the desperation of our situation, and Morrison's face took on an expression I had never seen before, the look of a man who had lost everything once and refused to let it happen again. He handed me the metal box containing Margaret's evidence and picked up his son, holding the baby close while making a decision that would determine all our fates. "There's another way out of here," he said, pointing toward a section of the cabin's back wall that looked identical to the rest but apparently concealed a hidden exit. "Margaret built this place with escape routes, knew that anyone who threatened Judge Sinclair would eventually need a way to disappear permanently." As the sound of approaching voices carried across the snow and the first shadows of our pursuers appeared among the trees, Morrison triggered a mechanism that opened the secret door, revealing a tunnel that led deeper into the mountain. The winter's confession had given us the truth we needed to destroy our enemies. But now we had to survive long enough to deliver that truth to the world, and the darkness that awaited us in Margaret's final escape route offered our only chance of seeing another dawn. The tunnel Margaret had carved into the mountain led us through 2 miles of darkness that felt like descending into the earth's frozen heart. But when we finally emerged into daylight on the far side of the ridge, I understood why she had spent months digging this escape route. We now stood above Juneau with a clear view of the town and a strategic advantage that would allow us to end Judge Sinclair's reign of terror on our own terms. Morrison carried Samuel in one arm and the metal box of evidence in the other, his face set with the grim determination of a man who had finally found his purpose after months of grief and rage. Behind us, we could hear the frustrated shouts of Sinclair's men as they discovered the empty cabin and realized their quarry had vanished like smoke in the wind. But ahead of us lay the most dangerous part of our mission, returning to a town controlled by our enemy to deliver justice that had been delayed far too long. The morning sun painted the snow-covered rooftops below us in shades of gold and crimson, a beautiful sight that belied the corruption festering in the heart of our community. And as I watched the tiny figures moving through the streets like ants in a maze, I felt the weight of responsibility for every innocent life that depended on our success. Morrison had studied Margaret's detailed plans for exposing her father's crimes, and he knew that timing would be everything we needed. To strike when Sinclair was most vulnerable, when the maximum number of witnesses could see the evidence that would destroy him forever. But first, we had to survive long enough to reach the territorial courthouse, where federal marshals were scheduled to arrive that very afternoon, drawn to Juneau by anonymous letters Margaret had sent weeks before her death. The shadows gathering over our town were about to be illuminated by the harsh light of truth, and Judge Sinclair's long night of evil was finally approaching its dawn. Our descent toward Juneau took us through terrain I had never seen before. Despite 7 years of walking its streets, hidden paths that Margaret had discovered during her investigation of her father's crimes, routes that allowed movement through the town without being seen by the network of informants and corrupt officials who served as Sinclair's eyes and ears, Morrison moved with the confidence of someone following a carefully memorized map, leading us through a maze of abandoned mine shafts and forgotten trails that brought us to the edge of town just as the church bells struck noon. From our concealed position behind the old cemetery, we could see unusual activity in the streets, men with rifles posted at strategic locations, groups of armed riders moving with military precision, and crowds of ordinary citizens who seemed to sense that something momentous was about to happen. The federal Marshals had arrived earlier than expected, their presence announced by the territorial flags flying from the courthouse steps and the sight of official carriages surrounded by guards who clearly outranked the local deputies. But Judge Sinclair was not a man to be caught unprepared, and I could see his countermeasures already in motion. His own armed men positioning themselves to control the courthouse approaches, loyal townspeople being organized into what looked like a spontaneous demonstration of support, and emergency meetings being conducted in buildings throughout the commercial district. Morrison studied the scene with the tactical awareness of a trained soldier, noting defensive positions and identifying potential allies among the crowd. And when he turned to me with Samuel sleeping peacefully in his arms, I saw that he had reached a decision that would require courage from all of us. "It's time," he said simply, checking the metal box one final time to ensure Margaret's evidence remained secure. Whatever happens next, her sacrifice won't be in vain. The first part of our plan required me to act as a decoy, drawing Sinclair's attention while Morrison positioned himself to deliver the evidence directly to the federal marshals. And as I walked openly through Juneau's main street for the first time in a week, I felt every eye in town following my progress toward the courthouse. Word of my survival had apparently reached Judge Sinclair, because within minutes of my appearance, Deputy Marshal Coleman emerged from the sheriff's office with his arm in a sling and murder in his eyes, flanked by 6 armed men who made no attempt to hide their weapons or their intentions. "Thomas Whitmore!" Coleman called out, his voice carrying across the street with the authority of someone who believed he still held the power of life and death over the town's residents. "You're under arrest for the murder of territorial officials and the kidnapping of an infant." The accusation was so absurd that several townspeople laughed openly, but I could see others backing away from me as if Coleman's words carried the weight of absolute truth. And I realized that Sinclair had spent the week since our escape spreading lies that would justify any violence committed against us. But I had anticipated this moment, had prepared for it during our journey through the tunnel, and as I stopped in the middle of the street with my hands clearly visible and empty, I raised my voice to address not Coleman, but the crowd of witnesses who had gathered to watch this confrontation. "Citizens of Juneau!" I shouted, my words echoing off the buildings and carrying to every corner of the main street. "I call upon you to witness the truth about Judge Robert Sinclair and the murders he has committed to protect his criminal empire." The effect was immediate and electric. Coleman's men raised their weapons while the townspeople pressed closer to hear what I had to say. And in that moment of tension and anticipation, I saw Morrison moving through the crowd toward the courthouse, with Samuel hidden beneath his coat and Margaret's evidence clutched against his chest. Coleman's response was exactly what we had hoped for, a violent overreaction that would expose his guilt to the federal marshals and the assembled crowd, proving that he and Judge Sinclair had something to hide that was worth killing to protect. "Silence him!" Coleman screamed, abandoning any pretense of legal procedure as his men raised their rifles and took aim at my chest. But their shots never came, because at that precise moment, Morrison stepped onto the courthouse steps with Samuel in his arms, and began reading from Margaret's journal in a voice that carried across the entire town square. "I, Margaret Sinclair, daughter of Judge Robert Sinclair, do hereby confess my knowledge of the following crimes committed by my father and his associates." Morrison's words rang out like a bell tolling for the dead, and the crowd fell silent, as they realized they were hearing the testimony of a woman they had been told died in a riding accident. He read the most damning entries from her journal, describing murders, theft, and corruption in detail that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of the judge's operations, and with each revelation, I could see the faces in the crowd changing from skepticism to horror to rage. The federal marshals emerged from the courthouse to investigate the disturbance, and when they saw Morrison holding up photographs and documents that clearly supported his accusations, they immediately moved to protect him from Coleman's increasingly desperate attempts to silence the truth. Judge Sinclair himself appeared on the courthouse balcony, his face a mask of fury and disbelief as he watched 20 years of carefully constructed power crumbling beneath the weight of his daughter's final testimony. But it was what happened next that would be remembered by every witness as the moment justice finally returned to our frozen corner of Alaska. The crowd's reaction to Margaret's revelations was swift and decisive, a roar of anger that seemed to shake the very foundations of the buildings around us as ordinary citizens realized how thoroughly they had been betrayed by the man they had trusted to uphold the law. I watched men and women I had delivered mail to for 7 years step forward to share their own stories of how Judge Sinclair had destroyed their families, stolen their property, and murdered their loved ones with impunity, and I understood that Margaret's courage in documenting these crimes had finally given the people of Juneau permission to speak their own truth. Coleman and his men found themselves surrounded by an increasingly hostile crowd that no longer feared their weapons or their authority, while the federal marshals took possession of the evidence Morrison had carried down from the mountain and began the process of placing Judge Sinclair under arrest for treason, murder, and conspiracy against the territorial government. But the judge was not finished yet. Even facing the destruction of everything he had built, he made one final desperate attempt to escape justice by drawing a concealed pistol and taking aim at the baby in Morrison's arms. "If I can't have my legacy," Sinclair screamed from the courthouse balcony, "then no one will." The shot that followed echoed across the town square like thunder, but it was not Samuel who fell. Morrison had seen the movement and shielded his son with his own body, taking the bullet in his shoulder while keeping the baby safe against his chest. The crowd's response was immediate and final. A dozen rifles fired simultaneously, and Judge Robert Sinclair tumbled from the balcony to land in the snow that had witnessed so much of his evil, his blood staining the white ground red as justice was finally delivered by the people he had oppressed for so long. In the days that followed, as federal investigators descended on Juneau to unravel the full extent of the corruption Margaret had exposed, I found myself caring for Samuel while Morrison recovered from his wound and prepared to testify before the territorial commission that would reshape Alaska's government. The baby had become a symbol of hope for our community, proof that innocence could survive even in the darkest circumstances. And watching him grow stronger each day reminded me that Margaret's sacrifice had not been in vain. Morrison and I had become unlikely partners in raising the child, united by our shared experience of almost losing everything to protect him, and I knew that whatever the future held, Samuel would grow up knowing the truth about his parents' courage and the price they had paid for justice. The military coat that had started our journey now hung in my repaired cabin as a reminder of the love that had transcended death and the determination that had overcome seemingly impossible odds. Dr. Harrison confirmed what we had all suspected, that Margaret had been pregnant when she began her investigation of her father's crimes, that she had spent months gathering evidence while knowing it would likely cost her life, that her final act of wrapping Samuel in Morrison's coat had been a message of love that reached across death itself to guide us to the truth. The shadows that had fallen over Juneau were finally lifting, replaced by the clear light of accountability and justice. But the memory of those dark days would remain with us forever as a reminder of how quickly evil could take root when good people remained silent. As I write these words by lamplight, while Samuel sleeps peacefully in his cradle and Morrison plans his return to civilian life, I understand that we have witnessed something rare and precious, the triumph of truth over power, love over hatred, and hope over despair in a land where such victories are never guaranteed, but always worth fighting for. The epilogue of our story unfolded over the following months as the full scope of Judge Sinclair's criminal network was revealed through Margaret's meticulous documentation and the testimony of victims who finally felt safe enough to speak their truth. More than 30 murders were attributed to the judge and his associates, along with theft of mining claims worth hundreds of thousands of dollars and corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Coleman and the Y Surviving members of Sinclair's organization were tried and executed for their crimes, while new officials were appointed to restore honest governance to our region. Morrison chose to remain in Juneau, using his military pension and a substantial reward from the territorial government to purchase land where he could raise Samuel in peace, and I was honored when he asked me to serve as the boy's godfather and help ensure he would grow up knowing the full story of his parents' heroism. Samuel's first word was "Papa," spoken while reaching toward the photograph of Margaret that Morrison kept on the mantel, and I knew that somewhere in the vast wilderness of Alaska, a mother's spirit was finally at rest knowing her child was safe, and her father's evil had been destroyed forever. The military coat was carefully preserved as a family heirloom, a tangible link to the love story that had changed our town and our lives, and on quiet winter evenings when the snow fell softly outside our windows, Morrison would tell Samuel stories about the brave woman who had given him life and the courage that would always flow in his veins. The shadows over Juneau had been banished by the light of truth, but more importantly, they had been replaced by the promise of a better future built on the foundation of Margaret Sinclair's ultimate sacrifice and the hope that justice, though sometimes delayed, would always find a way to prevail.